second subject that I want to address in talking about terrorism today is the causes of terrorism. Now, this is another question that researchers and policymakers have attempted to answer for many, many years. Even if we agree on what terrorism is, if everybody agreed to the definition that I've suggested, they certainly won't agree as to why. Why would anybody want to blow up, say, worshipers at a mosque, or commuters who are headed home on a bus, or people eating at a restaurant or in a bar? Why would they behead journalists or humanitarian workers on camera? These things seem extraordinary to us and very hard to explain, but we know that many people from a variety of backgrounds, different ideologies, different religious faiths, have engaged in these actions and engaged in them systematically. The answer that those who use terrorism would give us is that they had no other choice. They're implying that terrorism is the weapon of the weak, those who lack power. If terrorists had aircraft, they say, they would bomb from the air. They don't, so they use individuals who volunteer themselves to blow themselves up. But this really isn't a sufficient explanation, even if it's true. And it's not always true. It's not always the case that the users of terrorism are weaker than their opponents. In fact, recent groups such as radical Islamists, whom we sometimes call jihadists, require violence as a religious duty. They regard terrorism, what we would regard as terrorism, as an imperative, even if they had other means. They think it's something that is both justified, necessary, indeed an obligation. So, how do we go about analyzing the issue of causation? One of the first approaches that analysts adopted to causation was to look at what we would call macro-level conditions. This would be society, economy, political regime, and we would say, are these the causes of terrorism? Is it the environment in which terrorism occurs? So, over now decades, efforts have been made to link terrorism to, for example, poverty, inequality, injustice, democracy, or perhaps the lack of democracy, apocalyptic ideologies, the presence of American troops or American multinational corporations, Western cultural influences, globalization, any number of conditions. The problem is that very few people resort to terrorism. The numbers are very, very small, but large numbers, vast numbers of people live under these conditions or are affected by them in one way or another. So how can we explain the behavior of a few people in terms of what affects the many? Why doesn't everybody resort to violence under these conditions? And clearly they don't. So underlying conditions considered in the aggregate are not sufficient as an explanation, but it's not at all clear that they are even necessary to an explanation. For example, in the 1960s and 1970s, which is when the era of international terrorism began, those groups that used terrorism on the revolutionary left were very often the children of privilege, middle class, upper class. And those would-be revolutionaries in Western Europe, US, Canada, lived in functioning democracies. They could vote, they could protest, and in fact, terrorism was often the spin-off of protest movements. It seemed to be sort of the last resort of hardliners within a protest movement who weren't happy with the compromises that other protesters had made with the government. Sometimes in the 70s, terrorism was the work of separatists like the Irish Republican Army, who were doomed to be a permanent minority in a majority system. But still, the overwhelming majority of even people who favored separatism rejected violence and rejected terrorism. So this sort of conundrum led analysts to consider the other end of the spectrum of causation. If it's not very many people who are doing this, then perhaps we need to look at the level of the individual. This means we need to look at psychology, social psychology, demographic factors that might cause an individual to take the path of terrorism. There's currently quite a lot of interest in processes of radicalization. It falls in this category of inquiry of asking about individual motivation. And we ask, how do some individuals come to favor the use of violence in the service of, in this case, Islam? And can individuals be converted to very radical views through exposure to the internet? What induces young Muslims or converts to Islam to go abroad to fight, possibly to return home to commit acts of terrorism? Here we say, did they experience, say, discrimination, frustration? Some analysts have pointed to a death wish, a sense of romantic adventurism, family difficulties, and some have pointed to the case of suicidal tendencies in the case of what we usually call suicide terrorism, and those who use it are more likely to call martyrdom operations. We don't have answers to these questions, in part because there are not very many subjects who are available to interview and analyze, and it's also very difficult to compare the uses of terrorism to similar people in the same cohort who've rejected terrorism. One thing that we can say pretty decisively is that there's no psychopathology behind the resort to terrorism, and there's usually nothing very noticeable in the behavior or attitudes that would make potential recruits stand out among their peers. There's certainly no profile of the terrorist, although I think governments over many years have certainly sought to find one and invested resources in finding one. So if neither the macro level nor the micro level is adequate as an explanation, what about understanding the causes of terrorism at a middle, or what's sometimes called a meso level of analysis, looking at the group? In general, the individuals who engage in terrorism are not so-called lone wolves, despite the fact that there's a lot of interest in lone wolves these days. They are actually members of a group of people who think alike. They join a group of like-minded individuals, and often they're recruited through groups, not as individuals. And this is the case no matter what the ideology. It can be the far right, the far left, Islamists, separatists, doesn't matter. People, even if people join separately, which as I noted, often people are recruited in groups, say from a soccer team in Morocco, but once they join, they are bonded into a group. Maybe a small or a large group, some of it may be virtual, maybe more or less structured, but it's for a common cause and there's a sense of belonging. There are two implications here for why terrorism would happen. One is that recruits into terrorism, members of these organizations, develop a common identity. And this sense of cohesiveness and cohesion makes conformity and compliance with group norms extremely important. Makes it extremely difficult for people to break away from the group. And we have seen this, again, in many different circumstances over many years. They are subject to fairly extreme peer pressure. They exist under conditions of secrecy and danger. Sometimes they're part of a fighting corps. All this creates bonds that are extremely powerful, both among the members of the group and between the followers and their leaders. So this has caused some people studying terrorism to say that the real cause is not the ideological ambition to establish, for example, an Islamic state or, in previous cases, an independent state. This may not be the real cause of individual behavior in the sense of what's driving terrorism. In fact, students of military history know quite well that soldiers fight and die in battle for their buddies, not for an abstraction. The other implication for causation is that we really need to take the strategies and the cultures of militant organizations quite seriously. We can't assume that the resort to terrorism is a sign of individual irrationality or unreason or fanaticism or some sort of reaction, automatic reaction. Terrorism, I would argue, is usually calculating. It can be a miscalculation, but it's a result of strategic thought. And what this means is that we need to be careful to take note of what extremist groups say, their communications, rather than dismissing what they say as simple propaganda. They may be trying to influence an audience through what they say, but it's still an insight into how they think. The terrorists of the 21st century have become extremely clever at communicating their message via the internet. In the case of radical Islamists such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda, we often think of their ideas as archaic and retrograde, but if they are, and that's of course our view of what they are, they're accompanied by excellent communication and technical skills, particularly in the video domain. We should also note, in conclusion, that for a long time, Western observers dismissed the idea of establishing a caliphate in the heart of the Middle East as hopelessly utopian, only to see ISIS establishing control over sizable chunks of Syria and Iraq.